This video is about crystalline materials and how atoms are arranged inside of crystalline materials. So if you go to figure 4.8 in Ashby, you can see an example of how one particular type of atomic structure might look if we actually could look at the atoms. Now, the important thing to notice, in my view, is that we have these sort of simplified drawings of what a plane of atoms might look like if we could actually see the atoms. And we almost always, as scientists, sort of draw these very simple drawings where we've reduced atoms to little circles. And what we actually know is that if we could see the atom, probably the volume of that atom that's represented by what we imagine is a sphere is mostly space. The only part of that atom that is actually solid inside that imaginary sphere is the very center, and that actually occupies less than 0.1% of the volume. So when we talk about atoms as spheres, there's a way in which that's actually not real, that most of that is what we call an electron cloud. So this drawing that you see here in figure 4.8, where you have these spheres kind of packed in next to one another, it's a little bit fake. It's just sort of a model of the way that we think about crystalline materials. And this particular one is called a face-centered cubic material. And that's just an arrangement of the atoms, and I'll get to that later. But we can see that if we looked at a particular plane of atoms inside this material, what we would see is that the atoms, which we are pretending are hard spheres, are very much packed in next to each other. We call it close packed, so that there's really very little space in between the atoms. And it turns out that this is the most efficient space-wise arrangement of the atoms. So it turns out if we look at the layer above that, we would see that that layer is just like the first layer, but it's displaced, so that now the atoms are centered over what is a space on the first layer. And then again, if you looked at the next layer, you'd see that the next layer, represented by this orange set of spheres or circles, is positioned over the space from the previous layer. So if you actually were to follow the spaces, you could see that there's 3 different locations where the atoms can be, each plane of atoms. So there's what we might call the A location, where this little hand is. There's the B location, where the space is on the first layer, but now the atom is on the second layer. And then the C location, which is where this little hand is, but again, it's a space on the first layer, but where the third layer has its atoms. So this is where we say that the atoms, the plane of atoms, are stacked in an A, B, C configuration. Because they are, from the top view, they're stacked in this way. There's an A layer, there's a B layer that's displaced essentially from the A layer, and then the C layer that's displaced from that B layer. So that's an ABC stacking. This particular type of stacking of atoms is characteristic of a type of unit cell that we call the face-centered cubic unit cell. On page 61 of Ashby, figure 4.11, there's a different representation of that same unit cell, and that representation is in this center drawing, the face-centered cubic, or FCC unit cell. Now, you might not recognize this, partly because in this little drawing you have these little red lines dotted in solid lines that are showing you the form of some geometric shape. Well, of course, in the atoms you don't have, or in the crystal structure you don't have those lines. And the other reason you might not recognize it is we're looking at the three-dimensional arrangement of these atoms from a different viewpoint. So now, before we were looking at planes of atoms stacked up, and the plane that we're looking at is actually represented by this sort of greenish plane that has been shaded in and is surrounded by this dashed line. This was like an A version of the atoms. And if we were looking sort of perpendicular to that plane, which would actually be from this atom, corner atom here, down to the far corner atom of the cube there, we would see that the atoms would be stacked in this ABC configuration, that particular plane, that A plane right there. So we've actually twisted this viewpoint a little bit. So now we're looking at this, what we call the unit cell in the face-centered cubic material. Now the unit cell is the smallest geometrical volume of that material that represents the whole thing. So the unit cell, you can imagine, inside of face-centered cubic material is replicated in three-dimensional space in all directions. So this essentially contains all the symmetry and all the atoms that you'd see in the three-dimensional crystal. And there are different types of unit cells. In metals, the most common that you'll see is the face-centered cubic unit cell, which is figure 4.11b here. You also see the body-centered cubic cell, and as you can see, it has a different arrangement of the atoms. And you see something called the close-packed hexagonal unit cell. That's figure 4.11a. And this one is a little bit more difficult to see, but you can imagine that this one is based on a hexagonal shape, as shown by the top of this prism here. So figure 4.12 actually shows you how these different unit cells might be stacked in three-dimensional space. And figure 4.12b shows how the cubic unit cells might be stacked next to one another. And you can imagine this replicating itself out in 3D space. And then 4.12a shows the hexagonal. And then C shows a type of unit cell that we didn't cover, but this is what might be called a triclinic, where you don't have actually any kind of equal dimensions on any of the sides. So in 3D space, there are materials that have this triclinic shape. This is more typical of what you might see with maybe a ceramic material.